Hey guys, this is Josh with the Adept Ape Channel, and this is Class 2 in our Diesel Engine Course 101 video series. And this is actually the second time I've made this video. The first one I didn't like how it turned out, so I kind of scrapped it and started over. Hence the delay of an extra week on why it didn't come out. Thank you to everyone that has clicked the like button on the first video. It's gotten a lot of likes compared to most of my videos. Per capita, it's gotten more likes per view. So thank you very much for that. This second video, the one we're making now, is going to focus on the air management system and the Valvetrain. So the first one we talked about our piston rings, we talked about valves a little bit, we talked about the connecting rod and the crankshaft and the cylinder. This one's going to be focusing on the air side, so how air gets in and how air gets out. There's a lot to that, okay? So I hope you like the video. Okay, so since this is going to be focusing on the air management side of the engine, we touched on valves in the first video, but I didn't really describe what they were. I was basically using them as a way to turn off and on air to the cylinder. Now, when most people think of a valve, if they aren't around engines, they think of something like this. This is a hose valve. So this turns on and off water. Almost everyone that's seen this video is familiar with these. For the reason of engines, and in particular this video series, don't think of this as a valve anymore. For an engine, this is a valve. Now, if you've never seen one of these before, you might be wondering, like, well, how does this turn on or turn off something? I mean, it's basically just a stick with a mushroomed end. And how does it work? There's no knob or anything. Well, we're going to be talking a lot about these in this video, but that's going to be later in this video. I wanted to bring this up because you need to understand how this is shaped to get into the very important subject we're going to be discussing right now. And that subject is, in the first video we were discussing the cylinder and the piston, and I talked about a lid. Well, the lid would be the top of the cylinder. It's not part of the cylinder. However, it needs to seal the cylinder off. So it's going to be exposed to the combustion pressures and heat. Not only that, if you saw the little animation clip that I made at the end, you have valves going through it. Remember, the valves don't just hang in the air. They need to be closing off the exhaust or the intake to the cylinder. So something had to be devised that would sit on top of the cylinder to seal it off, also to contain all the valve components. Now, since it's allowing intake and exhaust air out in different areas, it needs to have ports. And this item is called a cylinder head. And we're going to talk about that a lot, starting right now. Now, getting back to this super simple illustration here, the vertical lines going here would be your cylinder and your cylinder wall. That's the lane that the piston's traveling in. Above that, where it says intake in blue, exhaust in red, and then injection in yellow, that's actually the cylinder head itself. And the blue and the red sections are your ports. You can see the valves there that are moving. Those are the black lines. Now, that whole section is basically the cylinder head, excluding the injector. And that's what we're going to be focusing on in the first part of this video here. So, what is a cylinder head? Well, this is a cylinder head. This is an automotive design. So this is a gasoline engine. This is a big block Chevy cylinder head. And this is what they call a bare head because it does not have valves in it. And the head doesn't have any moving components, but what it does have is mostly the ports. And what I'm pointing to here are the intake ports. They're the rectangular sections here. And there are 4 of them because this is over 4 different cylinders. Now you can see 2 other small ports on the ends of the cylinder head as well. Those are coolant passages. We're not going to be talking about the cooling system in this video, but there is coolant that flows through the cylinder head. Now this is the other side of the cylinder head. This is the exhaust side of the cylinder head. So these are your exhaust ports. You can see that these are square-shaped exhaust ports. And this is an cast aluminum head. Most diesel heads are going to be cast iron though. I'm using the big block Chevy because it's a very simple engine design. And we're going to get back to this port location here. So now you can kind of see what I'm talking about on intake and exhaust ports. You have your intake, which was the first clip, and then the exhaust was the last clip there. Now this is the bottom side of the cylinder head. This is the same cylinder head I was talking about. And as you can see, there's no valves in this, but If you look closely, the ring here is where the cylinder would seal against the cylinder head itself. So the head is obviously on top of the cylinder block and the cylinders, and then it's just sitting on top there. And you can see the valves are contained within the cylinder area. And if you look closely, you'll notice that the valves are different sizes. There's a larger and a smaller valve size, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later, explaining why that is. Now, if you look closely, also there's an area around where the valves are that's actually machined out of the cylinder head. And that's particularly common on gasoline engines because they're trying to reduce the compression ratio of the engine. So they have an area there on the cylinder head that's machined away. Okay, so this big old cylinder head is also a cylinder head, except this is for a diesel engine. This is off of a Caterpillar C12 engine. And we're looking at the bottom of it, of course, and you'll notice that this one has valves in it. And if you look closely, the valves are the same size. Not only that, there are 4 valves per cylinder, unlike that big block Chevy, which had only 2. So this one has 2 exhaust, 2 intake, whereas you could see on the big block Chevy, there's only a single intake, a single exhaust. Now notice that machined away area I was talking about as well. I'm kind of highlighting it here. You can see each cylinder has that machined away area. Typically on diesel engines, that does not have that. It's a flat cast iron cylinder head. And the reason for that is diesels are less concerned with reducing cylinder pressures and the compression ratio. So usually they'll have just a flat cylinder head. So big differences, multiple valves per cylinder, no machined away area. Also, this is a cast iron head, unlike most automotive applications currently, which have aluminum cylinder heads. Now, the next thing to notice on this is the ports. So these have very big intake ports, but if you notice next to them, there's also ports. So on the C12, and this is somewhat uncommon on diesel engines, it has the intake and the exhaust ports on the same side of the cylinder head. Now, you could do this on a gasoline engine as well. It's just not as common. This is kind of a throwback engine design. So the intake and exhaust manifolds are both on the same side of the engine. You can, of course, do that. They do separate the intake and exhaust air ports. They're just on the same side of the engine. Okay, so that's your cylinder head. Now, your cylinder head is fairly heavy. On that C12 one, the cast iron cylinder head, you're talking a couple hundred pounds. They can get up to several hundred pounds. And those are what seals the cylinder. That contains your valves, and it contains your intake and exhaust ports. Now, during combustion, the cylinder is creating enormous amounts of pressure. Before combustion, when that air is getting compressed, it can get up to a couple hundred PSI. When it actually combusts, it can create in the thousands of PSI of pressure. Now, even though that cylinder head's heavy, that's enough pressure to push the cylinder head off or blow out all the pressure. And of course, we don't want that. What we want is the cylinder head to stay in place and to harness that energy and push it into the crankshaft. So to keep that cylinder head in place, you need something to hold it there. And we haven't talked about them yet, but this is a bolt or a fastener. And this is a head bolt because it holds the cylinder head to the cylinder block. Now, I'll show you a picture of a cylinder block. We haven't really discussed that yet, but the cylinder block is basically the main component of the engine that holds all your cylinders. And it's typically a large cast iron piece, and the cylinder head bolts on top of that and, of course, seals off these cylinders. Okay, so we've discussed the cylinder heads enough, I feel. Now, we have to get into the valve train because the cylinder head doesn't have any moving components to it. It's just a cast piece, and it has ports in it. It holds components that do move, though. And, of course, the most critical of those parts are your valves. Now, there's different size valves, and most diesel engines, if they're turbocharged, have about the same size valves. But as you can see on the gas engine and on most naturally aspirated engines, so we're talking non-turbocharged engines, almost all early engines were naturally aspirated, you'd have 2 different size valves. Now, what do I mean by 2 different size valves? Well, you can see that this valve is smaller than this valve as far as the area of them. We're not talking about the length of the shaft or any of that. We're talking about the actual valve face itself. Now, the reason you would have different size valves is because during the intake stroke, as your piston is traveling down, it's pulling air in, but there's nothing mechanically forcing air into the cylinder. It's hoping that vacuum pulls enough air in. So that's why you would have a bigger intake valve typically than you would an exhaust valve, because during the exhaust stroke, as the piston's traveling up, the piston is mechanically forcing the air out of the cylinder. That's why you can have a smaller exhaust valve than you can an intake valve. Now, we're not going to talk about turbochargers in this video, but on a turbocharged engine, it helps push air in and out. That's why you typically don't have big valve differences like you would on a gasoline engine or on a non-turbocharged diesel engine. Okay, so I have to thank Stefano for hooking me up with a lot of these valve pieces he gave me. And I want to get into what actually holds the valves in place. Of course, there's machined ports in the head that allow the valves to go in them, but how do they actually work? I mean, if you look at them, there's no threads. It's not like they can be bolted into the head. Is something holding it in? Well, we're going to discuss that. So if you think of the bottom of the head, this is a valve insert here. This would be the port where air would be coming in or out of. So your valve would sit against it, and this would be the closed position. And when the valve opens, it would typically be like this, of course, because your cylinder is below the valve. The valve would open like this, and it would seal this port off in the head. So the valve is opening, allowing air in or out if it's an exhaust. And then it closes, and it then seals off the port, which allows no air in or out of that cylinder for that particular valve. And the amount of travel that the valve does is called lift. So if you have 1 inch of valve lift, that would mean the valve opens 1 inch and then closes 1 inch. So that's basically what we're talking about with the valve. The valve itself is just a piece of metal. It doesn't know when to open, when to close, and what's holding it in place? Well, let's talk about that. So you have those holes, and we'll use our valve seat here as an illustration once again. And you insert the valve through the bottom of the cylinder head, and then it sits against this valve seat. And then this top portion of the valve is called the stem, the valve stem. And the valve stem extrudes past the cylinder, or the cylinder head. So your cylinder head would basically be this area here. And you need a way to retain the valve where it is and a way to retract it when it's done doing its job of opening and closing. So, sorry about that. There's something that helps it from moving all over the place, and that's called a valve guide. So this would be a valve guide. This gets pressed into the cylinder head, and that keeps it from moving basically laterally, and it makes it just move very tightly in its bore. Now, this doesn't hold the valve in, it just keeps it from moving really any direction around. And all these parts, of course, can wear over time. The most important parts of the valve train are something called a valve spring. And as you can guess, it's a spring. Now, these springs, you can compress it a little bit, but they're very tight. You need a mechanical system basically to compress these. So if the top of your cylinder head were to sit here, this valve spring would sit on top of the cylinder head, and then you need a way to connect it to this valve so the valve doesn't just fall into the cylinder and, of course, destroy everything. So the valve spring will sit on top of the cylinder head. This is a little clumsy, but you kind of get the idea. It sits on top of the cylinder head, and then you have this piece which helps the valve rotate, and it holds the top of the spring in place. And then you have these really little pieces that, if you see these grooves on the valve itself, these are called keepers, and you can see they have 2 ridges in them. And those ridges are a real pain to get on. If you put them on correctly, you can see they're tapered slightly. This top portion here is tapered as well. And once they're in place, they can't be removed because they're compressed together. And that top port is called a rotocoil. And then the valve spring sits up against it. So you have your machined piece. So if you think of my hand as the top of the cylinder head, you have your spring, you have your rotocoil, which allows the valve to rotate as it's opening and closing, and then your keeper's there. Theoretically, this is a complete valve. Now, there'll usually be a seal here to help the valve, not any oil get into the cylinder, not any air get out of the cylinder into the crankcase. But that's basically what the valve system looks like. You have your valve seat, your valve guide, your valve spring, your rotocoil, and your keepers, and then, of course, the valve itself. And that is basically the valve and how it works. Okay, so you're now an expert on cylinder heads and valves. Okay, not an expert, but at least you understand how they work. Now, the valve itself, we discussed how it's in the head, but we still haven't determined what tells it when to open, when to close, and how much. So what pushes it down and allows it to, well, what comes back up is the spring. The spring tension forces the valve back up after it goes down. So something pushes it down. And that item's typically called a rocker arm. Now, this is actually something called a lifter, but a rocker arm is very similar to this. And what it is, it's usually bolted to the top of the cylinder head, and it sits on top of the valve. And when something tells it to, it pushes down and opens the valve. Now, we're going to go back to thinking like we're designing our first engine here. And we need something that tells this valve, whether it's an intake or an exhaust valve, when to open and close, because if you remember from the first video, they have to open and close at a specific time. The intake valve has to open when the piston's traveling down in the cylinder during the intake stroke, and the exhaust valve needs to open when the piston is traveling up in the exhaust stroke. And of course, then they need to close before the combustion stroke. So what would open and close that valve and keep it so that it's always at the right time in comparison to the piston? So basically, we need something that's connected to the crankshaft, because if you remember, the crankshaft connects to the piston, and the crankshaft rotates, and it is basically controlling the piston's up and down motion. So we need something connected to the crankshaft that we could time to it so that it would open and close the valves in the right timing to the engine. Now, this would have to be something strong. It would have to be something mechanical, because remember, we have to overcome that valve spring tension. And the valve spring tension can be a lot. It can be hundreds of pounds to compress that fully. Not something you're going to compress with your hand, especially a diesel valve spring like this. They do get very small if you get to a very small gas engine, but still, to compress these as much as you're going to, as often as you're going to, you need something strong and mechanical. Now, it can't be an on and off, because the valve, remember, sits up against that seat. And if you were doing something where it just slams it in every time, it would damage the valve or the seat or cause them to wear very early. So basically, you want something that will slowly start to open the valve and then quickly towards its full lift, open it fully, and then come back up rather quickly. And then as it gets close to the top where it's going to touch that valve seat, slow down. So it would need to be something that instead of a square would almost have to be kind of an egg-shaped item. Because remember, you're dealing with a rocker arm that's going to be riding on this device. So that rocker arm would need to ride on it, and as it's pushing the valve down, it would need to be some sort of designed item that would be kind of an egg-shaped. Well, this item, if you haven't thought about it yet, is called a camshaft. And the reason it's called a camshaft is because it's full of cam lobes. And if you've ever seen a cam lobe, it's basically an egg-shaped lobe. So it's mostly circular, and then it has a rounded tip on the end. So I've got a couple pictures of a camshaft here by itself. So it is a little hard to see, but you can see that there's an actual rise on each lobe, and that is what I was talking about, where it's not an on-off. It's actually a gradual increase that helps push that valve open. and then it slowly tapers off, so you're not slamming the valve open and closed. And the camshaft's typically about the length of the engine, and it has a lobe for each intake and exhaust, and this particular engine actually has an injector lobe, but we'll be discussing that later. Now, if all goes according to plan, here is a Valvetrain in action. Now, this engine's actually idling at about 700 RPM. This is how fast your intake and exhaust valves are opening at idle. Now, imagine when you're going down the road at 15, 2000 RPM. They're going very quickly. Okay, so now we know what a camshaft is. One thing we need to realize about the camshaft, though, is it spins at half the speed of the crankshaft. Now, why does it do this? You have to remember that the piston goes up and down twice for every time the intake or the exhaust valve opens. If the camshaft was spinning at the same speed as the crankshaft, so for every rotation of the crankshaft, the camshaft spun one time, your intake and exhaust valves would open every time the piston went up and down. Of course, we don't want that because the piston needs to go intake, compression, power, and exhaust for one complete cycle. Now, it only needs to open the intake valve once and the exhaust valve once for that time. So when you're timing your crankshaft and your camshaft together, you need to use what they call reduction. Now, how you time the crankshaft typically on a diesel engine is done with a gear drive. So you have sets of gears, and typically the cam gear is much bigger than the crank gear. It's about twice as big, and that's because it needs to spin at half the speed of the crankshaft in order for the Valvetrain to work properly. Now, I'm only going to touch on this briefly, but there's basically two different styles of camshaft engines as well. There's what they call an overhead cam, so that means the camshaft sits in or on top of the cylinder head, and it basically opens and closes it forces the rocker arms to open and close the valves directly. Now, there's disadvantages and advantages to this, but there's also what they call a pushrod engine. This is where the camshaft typically sits very close to the crankshaft in the cylinder block, and then something called a pushrod, which would be this, sits in a lifter, and this opens or pushes the rocker arms up and down to open and close the valves. Now, each engine design has its advantages and disadvantages, because if you move the camshaft up, you get rid of the push rods, but then you have more gears and the cam's further away from the crankshaft. So it creates its own issues. Of course, you're getting rid of the push rods, which these can bend, they can break. So there's really no perfect engine design. That I just wanted to touch on briefly. Now, we've covered a lot in this video, and hopefully it helps you to better understand what the cylinder head is, how the valves work, how they're seated in the cylinder head, what the camshaft is, cam lobes, cam timing, all that stuff. Basically, all the air management side of it, okay? Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I try to get a lot of information in there. Hopefully you tune in for the next episode. We're probably going to be focusing on the crankshaft, and we might get into the oiling system, okay? So thanks for watching.